Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
Today we are with David Pryor, who is an eclectic man, a bit difficult to describe because he was involved in slow food and then he wrote for travel magazines of great importance like Traveler Magazine, Vogue, Living, New York Times, Style Magazine, Wall Street Journal Magazine, and Financial Times. And then he has created a company called Pryor, who is a community of curious travelers. And now we're going to talk to him and try to find out what is the fil rouge of his existence. So I was curious, you grew up in Brisbane in Australia. Why did you go to Pollenza, to the University of Gastronomic Science, Slow Food, to study with Carlo Petrini? I mean, how did you make this country?
Well, it's probably a strange story, but I was always interested in food and actually always interested in magazines. I used to make collages out of the world when I was younger. And I think that food is kind of a bit of a gateway to the rest of the world. So I was always interested in that. I finished high school and was going to do a bit more of a conventional university degree, but then I kind of discovered nightclubs and partying. And so then I landed in a kitchen in Sydney, somewhere cooking. And on Tuesday nights, I used to work in a cooking school where I would kind of do the dishes, but it was a great opportunity to listen to cooks and learn, about their travels. And one time a chef had come back from Italy, from Piemonte, which, if I'm honest, I didn't even know what that was, and described this university called the University of Gastronomic Sciences in Pollenza. I hadn't gone to university. That would be very strange for my overachieving family and siblings. So I decided to write a letter to them. I applied, and 2 weeks later, I learned that I had a scholarship. And then not long after that, I landed in Bra with a suitcase and was there for 3.5 years. But it's interesting. I think that something appealed to me about the international scope and the philosophy of Carlo Petrini and slow food. I felt like they, had a curiosity in the world, and I wanted to go out and experience the world. Brisbane is not, although it has changed a lot, was not a very worldly place, let's say. And I always thought somehow that I was born in the wrong place, if that makes sense. So it was a passport to the rest of the world. And for some reason, it feels like a lucky opportunity. I don't know if everyone believes in luck.
What did Carlo Petrini taught you? I mean, what did you learn in Pollenza? I mean, besides having a degree, when you came out, what did you have in your hands? I mean, what did you learn?
A philosophy around protecting the diversity in the world. They have this, which is very well known, obviously, in Italy, the Presidio products. And by protecting that piece of biodiversity and also cultural diversity, I found like that was really, the colors of the world, and it inspired a level of curiosity. So for me, I think it was both the international nature of the student body. I met so many people from so many different places that intrigued me. And I think that philosophy around preservation, but also celebration of beauty and diversity was the thing that kind of inspired my approach.
From Pollenza, which was the place of the slow food in a way, even if it is in this small city of Bra in the middle of Piedmont, then you went to the US and you went to work with Alice Waters, who is probably a kind of Carlo Petrini of the United States. And she has, instead of a school, she has a famous restaurant called Chez Panis. You became the director of communication there. So how come from Bra to California?
I actually always, strangely, not knowing what Alice Waters looked like, her original cookbooks never had photos of food. They had botanical illustrations, which is something that I've always been interested in. So strangely, I went to like a young farming conference through the university with Carlo Petrini in Puebla, Mexico, and sat next to Alice. And we got chatting, and then she invited me to come and do an internship for an event called Slow Food Nation, where they created an incredible garden in front of the Civic Center, the City Hall in San Francisco, which many people think was kind of the precursor, or at least the symbol that allowed Michelle Obama to adopt planting the garden in front of the White House. So I guess Alice's philosophy similarly appealed to me from a food perspective, simplicity of ingredients, celebrating culture in that way. And actually, I didn't really say that post-university was going to work there. Petrini kind of called up Alice and said, David, you are going to work. Alice, meet David. You're going to go and work for her, after I'd done that internship. But Alice's philosophy always appealed to me. And it kind of happened not by accident, because I've always been kind of ambitious to travel the world, and I didn't want to go back to Australia necessarily. But yeah, I landed there, and I remember Alice operates in a very small way, with having a very huge international scope. So working with her very directly for that number of years, writing articles with her, it was a little bit of a gateway.
What kind of cuisine you were proposing at Chez Panisse? It's slow food, but what kind of food?
For Alice, it was always about the ingredients and the farmers, which also I would argue is the same philosophy of slow food. It's called California cuisine, but really it's about celebrating whatever the farmers are growing in that particular region. And that, for example, when I travel the world, is super exciting to me. The first thing I do very often when I land in a particular place is go to the market, because that becomes a little bit of a roadmap around what you're going to eat, what's in season, what's the culture. And I think that I learned that from Alice for sure. I just think that food is somewhat like the gateway into understanding, or at least my lens in which to understand the world. That's how it began.
So you started when you were there, and then afterwards, as we said at the beginning, you started traveling and writing for magazines. We said travel, about food, travel, style. You worked for Traveler, for Vogue, for New York Times, many different newspapers. What were you writing about? You became a name in that field. What happened?
One of the things that I would do is I would just travel to a place without a story in mind and drop myself there and find the story. Whether it was a guide to the riads in Marrakesh, which is going to be a bit more simple, or just going to Sao Paulo and discovering that at a certain moment it had the best nightlife of anywhere in the world. I'm able, I think, to meet people and connect with people at every level to understand what is special, what is the story, what is the only in factor in a particular place. So I was writing about a wide variety of things. I guess the thing that I always cared about most is what is reflective of the culture in a particular place, of that particular moment, what is timely and timeless. I wrote about a wide scope of things. I guess the signature thing that I would do is really tell a story of the place and allow people to understand what is the essence of that, which kind of led to what I'm doing.
But how
now.
did you make the choice of the places, and did you have a base where you lived during that period of your life? You were still living in California and then traveling?
Well, the writing thing started actually when I was at university, because some editors used to come into the cafe that I worked in. I wrote some emails to them that was very excited about what I was doing. And then they asked me to write a little bit. So even when I was at university, that's kind of how I earned a little bit of pocket money in order to travel while I was based in Bra. And then Alice was very gracious to allow me to travel sometimes. And I traveled often with her and then write articles. I guess in the end, it was an editor who was the editor-in-chief at that time, called Deborah Needleman at the New York Times Style magazine, who gave me a little bit my break in the New York media world. So how would I choose the particular places? It just goes on instinct, I think. It's just like any editor, like what are people talking about? What am I interested in? I guess I have a sense of curiosity generally, that's the thing, and then also a sense of romance. And also, I didn't get to travel when I was growing up. So sometimes I would just put a finger on a map, frankly. And then I would go there because you can always find the stories.
But during this period when you were traveling, do you remember some particular places that have impressed you or that remain in your heart, in your mind?
Yeah, I went a couple of months before the civil war started in Syria. And for me, Damascus was like Rome and Aleppo was like Florence. That was something that at that point, people were talking about Damascus as being the new Marrakesh, which of course is seems completely absurd at this point. But yeah, I just decided, honestly, 48 hours beforehand that I would land in Damascus. And I got my photographer friend to come and we shot a very beautiful story that ultimately didn't end up running. But I have these images and the words. The lesson in that, I think, is that everything is so fragile and that it can be gone. Like Aleppo, for example, is just not there in the way that it was. And so I think the idea that we can take for granted any of these particular places and our cultures is a motivating factor. And then I've traveled all over the place, and in many ways you can find something special. I wanted to leave Australia for my whole life, basically. But then when I was at Condé Nast Traveler, I ended up being the person that was responsible for Australia, ironically. So I almost had to learn to love my country again in many ways. And I kind of think about looking at certain places for the traveler through a particular lens, right? For me, Australia is the most visceral example, let's say, of humans' connection to the power of the land. You know, India, if you want to look at it from a particular point of view, go there for an experience about belief. Italy, even though it is incredibly dense with so many things, I think food is the great doorway in. Spain might be cultural celebrations and festivals. Mexico, handicrafts. Morocco, understanding how the home and hospitality becomes critical. And all of these things are in all of those different cultures. But very often the way that I think about entering a place is from a particular point of view. And that becomes the kind of opening factor.
We're talking about your own country, Australia. Do you usually read books? For instance, did you read the books of Bruce Chatwin on Australia, or the book of Robert Hughes on Australia? I mean, two very important books.
For sure. I reread Bruce's book about 18 months ago, because you may be aware there was a referendum in Australia about Indigenous recognition and rights, which I was somewhat involved in terms of the Yes campaign. And so I revisited that in a way to understand a little more. And then also you bring that up. That's a perfect example of ways in which for me to explain through Bruce's book what's happening in Australia around that. I would say that Australia is a little bit more of a, I know it so well, but rediscovering it was really about being in environments that I used to find unappealing. Traveling and experiencing the desert, or the Red Centre, as we would call it, going to Uluru, things that I would never have done because I wasn't interested in exploring my own country. And so it's been really interesting. And now I'm kind of an ambassador for Tourism Australia. So refinding that country has been something quite profound for me, I think.
But in 2018, you changed a bit your life. I mean, not the idea of traveling, but you made traveling your business, and you created Prior, a community of curious travelers. And very soon, Bloomberg named you one to watch. And they also said that Prior would influence the future of travel.
Well, I mean, I hope so.
Why did you create Prior, and how can we describe it? What is it?
It began because I was creating these stories, often these cover stories, shooting these stories in various different places, telling the story of them and trying to get people curious and inspired with writing. And it really became an experiment. I took a bunch of friends to India over 21 days because I'd been there a year beforehand and a number of times before that. And I felt like, okay, how do I bring a magazine story to life? Like, the reason that I was writing was not to have a byline particularly. It was really to encourage people to go and to experience that. And that's the thing that I found rewarding. So I also understood that storytelling would change and media would change. And the way that you could influence people was actually in a real sense. So I created this company basically because I took a trip and I took some friends and it kind of got some attention, and I understood that I really loved hospitality and also creating these experiences. How do you spotlight the best of a country and then almost not exaggerate it, but amplify it? We started with a small cohort of travelers who had an aligned point of view and an editorial platform, let's say. So we would do stories every week. The aesthetic look of the company is full of collages, which is what I have always done to kind of project an image or an idea or a fantasy of a particular place and then make it real. So yeah, it started as a cohort of travelers that maybe I knew or that it was word of mouth. And then 15 months later, the pandemic happened and things have changed radically since then, I would say.
What is Prior doing is organizing group voyages, right? And you have groups of 6-8 people and maximum 28 people, more or less. I read that you had a trip in Nepal, and then you went to see the Stefan Ross in Slovenia. Then you had a felucca going down the Nile or up the Nile. Then you went to Uruguay. Then you have a trip in Provence, from Provence to Paris, or the riding in the Dolomites. I mean, they're very eclectic kind of journeys, but these are bespoke journeys in the sense that a group of people tells you we want to go there, or you propose them. How does it work?
It's a bit of a combination of the two. Sometimes we do bespoke trips for individuals. And like you said, sometimes we create these group experiences. And the reason why I like the group experiences is that sometimes these experiences are better shared. And it also gives me a bigger canvas in which to create experiences. And honestly, we create trips in places that I'm curious about. It's somewhat selfish because then I can go there, do the research and development, and then bring something to life. So it's very eclectic indeed. And how I choose it is just by instinct around where I think people will go and what I'm curious about.
What kind of people come? I mean, these trips organized by you, they are very expensive. They're just available to a certain kind of people, or?
They're very specific, and the way we talk about them are very specific. So it somewhat becomes a self-selecting crew of people. There isn't a barrier to entry other than curiosity, frankly, and also the types of experiences that we're doing. When I started this, my editor-in-chief at Condé Nast Travel at the time said, "You are literally the last person that I thought would host group trips because you're so out there and independent and would never do that." And I found that, yeah, it can be a special experience. So I think that people who have somewhat of a creative bent have a sense of romance, frankly, and are curious about the world. I would say that's the only thread. Some trips are more expensive because these things cost to do well very often, but others are not so much. I'm also interested in not being like a travel agent for oligarchs, right? That's why we have a free newsletter, a very inexpensive subscription, so we can inspire people to travel even if they can't afford it yet, or that they can do it themselves. So some things are very expensive because it is expensive to close down XYZ cathedral or house or privatize something. But other things, and I think it's core to this, my philosophy, is this high-low. You know, I come from the school of Carlo Petrini. It's not going to be the simplest, humblest thing is often the thing that most surprises people. And it's also very often this mix that attracts me.
You put together people from all over the world, or there are more people coming from Australia, United States, whatever? And then another question is, are these groups, because the people, they don't know each other maybe, you know, how do you put them together, you know, and do they become friends or they hate each other? What happens?
You know, it's really interesting just on the point of hating each other. That has almost never happened. I'm on dozens of WhatsApp groups from people that kind of fell in love with each other. So like, I know we both know Madison Cox, for example. You know, we did a trip with Madison, Deborah Needleman, my former editor. Deborah and I hosted a trip about textiles in India. Madison came, Morella Caracciolo came. Then a group of women from Brisbane who I've known since I was a child, and then other random people from all around the world. And then they've become great friends. And this happens one trip after the other. Last weekend, Martina Mondadori and I were hosting an Inside Milan trip. Cabana and Prior have a partnership, and there were people from Kuwait, from Turkey, from Australia, from the UK, from the US. I think Prior has a very global reach, and I think it attracts a certain type of person from around the world.
But you're not going with them all the time, right? How does the Prior organization work? I mean, I think you have some people working with you. You say that they are more or less like Swiss guards. or they have a very strong military-like team, very well organized. I mean,
right.
Where are you based? How many you are?
Yeah. The main office is between New York and newly Milan, but we have people in Buenos Aires, Uruguay, Paris, California, all around the world. And it's split kind of between people that are editors and writers, or people that are more focused on the creative, and then people that are organizing. They're making the calls, they're liaising with the fine details of the very complicated execution of these trips, either for individuals or for groups. And then travel designers, people that are expert at creating and weaving together experiences in particular places. Increasingly, what we're doing, and this Italian experiment, is building our own execution and experiences on the ground. So the thing about the travel industry, which people may not know, is there are travel agents and there are tour operators. And these travel agents and tour operators often use the very same fixer. So you're going to get the exact same experience, even if it's coming from a different perspective or a different packaging, let's say. So what I would like to do is kind of make our travel magazine come to life and execute it ourselves, which is quite different in a lot of ways. So we've started with Italy, and then we're adding countries and experiences that we kind of have an exclusivity on, whether it's like a creative take on a particular aspect or whether it is
let's say you talk about Italy or Morocco, what would you organize? I mean, let's say a person comes to you and says, I would like to do a trip. It is pre-packaged, or how do you operate?
Some will be pre-packaged, but in those experiences, we will say, visit the Nocciola farmer in the Langhe, or a particular winemaker that doesn't offer like tourism experiences. So there's like trips in Piemonte, which is like close to my heart, for example. And they're also not expensive because I want people to experience that. So they can be pre-packaged in a way. Other things are entirely bespoke. I'll use this example of this trip last weekend. We got a private visit to the Last Supper. Now, that you can buy, and other people can buy that. But we also visited the home of Umberto Pasti and Stephen Jansen, which is a super special experience. And then other things might be, we're weaving together a curation of the right pasticceria that will come from my perspective. So, that's a close to home example. But in other places, I'm going and visiting a Berber village this afternoon because I want to make sure that if we are sending people here, that they experience the rug making in the authentic way. So I'm building experiences now with this team here. That applies kind of all around the world.
And it works well. It's growing up. I mean, people nowadays, even with all the economical problems, inflation, the wars and all that, they still travel a lot. And if I understand well, your trips are only leisure trips in a way, or cultural trips. I mean, they're very different from business trips or from all these people who nowadays go from the Art Basel to Venice Biennale to Korea to Hong Kong, or to New York for the auctions or art fairs or cinema events. I mean, nowadays people travel a lot for that.
The interesting thing about the pandemic, it was happening for some time that the idea of luxury or nourishment of oneself, let's say, or an indulgence was changing from what you would put on your back or the bag that you would hold to an experience. And then the pandemic really turbocharged that. And I would say, looking at the way that luxury goods is quite unstable at the moment, in fact, dropping in various areas, and travel continues to grow, both in terms of people's desire, but also the industry and often sometimes the price point, in fact. It's just an interesting cultural shift. I would put it down to the fact that people want to find some level of connection. I think that we're very disconnected in this connected world, let's say. So there's that for sure. We don't do business travel, it's true. We do leisure, cultural travel. And we tend to ask people to trust us and let them take them by the hand. So we don't operate like a typical travel agency in the sense of book me a hotel in St. Bart's this weekend, if that makes sense.
Yeah. But for instance, I think you also changed because as you talked about Syria. Syria nowadays is not the best recommended place to travel. Israel is in trouble. Ukraine and Russia and countries around there are in trouble and so on and so forth, right? So you have to change according to politics and sadly, and according to what's going on in the world.
Yeah, the pandemic made me very agile, I would say. And then in terms of world affairs, yes, you have to have a wide scope and you have to maneuver in that way. Gaza and Israel, Ukraine and Russia notwithstanding, and also parts of Central Africa. Again, the travel world has matured a little bit because I think before, if something would happen in Morocco, people wouldn't go to Istanbul for whatever erroneous reason. I do think now people are more willing to and understand a little bit more and are willing to travel to places that they once, they would completely discount an entire region if there was one place that was having an issue. I mean, we can't tell what will happen in the world. Travel is a volatile business, that's for sure, as the pandemic proved and as conflict happens, and then also economic stability, that's for sure. I mean, if you want to be involved in something that is predictable, don't get into the travel industry. But that's part of the beauty of it, to be honest.
Nowadays, there is, like in any other thing, there's a great discrepancy, right? In one way, there are daily tourists, there's people who go to Rome as pilgrims, or that they are in Venice for the day, or they are, I don't know where, for the day, and they don't buy anything, or just little souvenirs and eat sandwiches. And in the other way, you have hotels and group of hotels who are more and more expensive all over the world. I mean, they cost, let's say, an absurdity for normal people, right? It's obvious that you can't spend $3,000 per night in a hotel. I mean, you can, but there are very few people who can afford that. So
Right.
How do you steeplechase around this for your travelers? How do you organize your trips? What level of hotels, restaurants? And then another thing, when you go, who knows, to a city, you mentioned Martina Mondadori, but it can be the Maharaja Jaipur. I mean, you make these people maybe invited from prominent people, or you take them to visit the atelier of artisans in Milan, or the artists in New York, or so on and so forth.
I would say the first instance, the reason why we are able to connect at every level with people, whether it's the right guide in India or whether it is Prince XYZ, is when you are curious about someone's thing that they're most proud of, genuinely, the doors open very quickly. So I've never had a problem connecting at kind of every level in wherever I go. I'm not sure why that is, but I think it just comes from like a genuine curiosity and respect. And I also think that that's something for sure that I learned from Carlo Petrini, because he's absolutely the master of being able to do that. And on that note as well, you can go to places and experience it in, dare I say, authentic, which is a word that I still like, but has become a cliche. You can experience that in ways that are not expensive, for sure. And also, the most expensive thing is not always the best thing. Now, would I say that I think that travel has the ability to, in certain places, shine a spotlight on what is special about a place and tell that story and allow its preservation because of that. But that intensity of spotlight can also burn it and destroy it. And we're in a moment where how you weave that is very difficult. Like, you do not want it to be, and I'm not interested in it being this entirely elite proposition, because I think everyone should have a passport. And I hope that a lot of what we do is at the very highest end, because that's part of business. So do I have an answer, a clear answer on how tourism can balance? I'm not sure. But what I would say is you can go to Venice, even if it is for the day, and experience something that is not outrageously expensive if you eat at the right place, so you understand what you need to see. And maybe, yes, you're not staying at the Griddy, or you're not staying at the Cipriani. Not that that necessarily is, in my view, the best, but there are ways in which you can do that. And there are ways in which it's incumbent upon us to tell the right story about what is special so that people respect that.
And people who travel nowadays are more old people who retire, who have more time, who have more money, or also very young people or young people who want to do these kind of trips?
It's mixed. I would say that for us, we probably skew much younger and much more from the creative world. Our average age is probably like 42 to 44, and there's a big spectrum. And again, what attracts us to people, I think, is the curation of what we do and the creation of it. So it's not so much about age. I think at any age, you can be curious about certain things. But yeah, I would say that probably where price point and age meet, we're probably on the younger end of the spectrum. Now, do I think that like older people who are retiring have more disposable income and time in which to travel? Yes, of course. But I find that now working people want to be able to work from home or work away from home for a period of time. And very often that ties into travel. Similarly, people in the United States, I know that for sure, are negotiating 5 weeks vacation rather than 10 days. And that just shows you, younger people are really valuing the ability to be able to travel. So I wouldn't say that it's one particular demographic.
And which are the places where you think that people like the most? Are the places that you propose, or are the places?
I think what we saw after the pandemic was a big rush towards Western Europe and familiar places that had a kind of sense of like familiar safety and kind of glamour in that sense. That's why you saw the Amalfi Coast explode, the Côte d'Azur as well. And that hasn't really slowed down. It slowed down a little bit in Italy last year. But what I'm seeing right now is people wanting to return to Asia. I mean, Japan is just huge. It's the most popular for sure. But now I start to see it in Vietnam, start to see people returning to India. I think now people are moving to places that are less familiar, I would say, which is exciting, actually. So I wouldn't say there's one particular destination. I do think that there's a big pull right now to Asia in general.
But if I would call you, or I would call Prior and say, listen, I want to take my family to Scotland, for instance, and I want to do something special in Scotland, not just to go to Edinburgh or Glasgow or whatever, but maybe there are these islands around, Would you be organizing that, or it has to be pre-packed?
No. There are some prepackaged things because I want people to be able to experience those, and it allows us to refine our own product. But I would say to you, Alan, there's an extraordinary project by the guy that founded ASOS, who had that terrible tragedy in Colombo with his family and the terrorist attack. He's very involved in rewilding, and in Scotland, he's the largest private landholder. He's created this project called Wildlands, which is gigantic estate and huge tracks all around the country, all the way to the north in the Cairngorms as well. And then he's created these huts like bothies and houses and all sorts of different accommodation options, which is perfect for a family. So that would be the first thing that would come to mind. And interesting you say that, because and maybe that was just an example that you plucked from your head, but Scotland is a destination that people are interested in. I think next summer will really be a spot to go. Like Norway this summer is definitely a thing and has been.
But if a person would tell you, I'd like to stay in a place, I'd like to be, who knows, in Tangiers for 2 weeks in a house, or I would like to be, who knows where, in any place in the world to be, would you also try to find this kind of thing or not? Because this is a different way of traveling. I mean, there are people who like to go every day in a different thing, to see everything in 3 or 4 days, in 10 days. Others who like to stay. Let's say I would like to stay in Istanbul for a week or 10 days in who knows. Would you also do this kind of thing?
We aren't the everything store, and I will be very frank, if I don't know the place particularly well, or I don't know the right person that I trust to ask. But it's an amazing geographic spread, because I think once you have the trust of certain people in certain places, again, you ask someone about the place that they're from or the thing that they care about, the doors open so quickly. It's about understanding and connecting with the right person, let's say.
Yeah, because clients, let's call them clients or people, are very different. For instance, I know that the American people are very fussy, right? Or they used to be in their travels, or very suspicious of local foods, or because they may contract illness or things like this. Or Italians probably are less fussy or whatever. I mean,
there's a reason why we do the editorial and why that's really important. And there's a reason why the brand or the company looks the way that it does. It becomes a very self-selecting thing. It is better for me to say no to someone if I don't feel like our values and aesthetic are aligned than it is to take it on board and not do a job. Because ultimately, it's not a democracy of taste in my company. I can kind of meet people where they are and we can make it a collaboration around something. But if they're not aligned, it doesn't work necessarily. And that's why I didn't call it Amazing Adventures.
The people who come to you are people who want a sort of adventure, right? They're looking for something else.
You know what they're looking for? They're looking for something that's not fake. And in the travel world, there's a lot of things that are a pastiche and fake of a place. It doesn't mean that it has to be ancient in every place. It doesn't mean that it can't be new. But if it's lacking some kind of soul, some sense of truth, some sense of timelessness and timeliness, and reflecting the culture or the environment, that is the only places that I'm interested in, and the only places that the people who come to us are interested in as well.
And you want to get what is essential about this very place or
yes.
unique about the place. That's what you're looking for, right?
Exactly. And the strange thing is, and this sounds like a real anathema to what I'm saying about authenticity and the essence, but sometimes what you need to do is find the essence and exaggerate it in a sense. Sometimes that gets to the ultimate truth of it. You want to go to Seville, you want to experience flamenco, right? You don't necessarily want that kind of tourist thing, right? But how do you experience it in the most majestic way, the most dramatic way that is true to a particular place, but that is, heightened, right? I'm always thinking about it in that way because you want people to feel a sense of romance about travel, and you want to identify what is the only and what is the special thing about a particular place. That's why I was saying, I think about it in lenses, right? Because you can't cover everything. So yes, it's getting to the essence, but it would be too simple to say what we do is getting to the essence because
but for instance, you describe the anatomy of Mexico City via its markets. That's what you said.
Absolutely its markets, for sure. And whether it's the art market as well, is a sense that is the absolute essence of it, for sure. It's that street life thing. It's that connection. That's very astute because that's exactly how I think about Mexico City as well.
Why traveling you started to collect textiles? What textiles have to do with your work?
Because very often the people making those textiles are stewards of culture, right? It's this interesting mix of function and beauty. It can be very much about the daily life, but it can also be the expression of raw materials of a particular place. It's like in a textile, you see a lot about where it's from, both in terms of the natural world, but also the culture, the aesthetic, the colors. That's a very codified way of collecting things. I collect all sorts of things, but textiles, I find it to be something that you can feel that there's a memory in there, if that makes sense. And it's not so high-minded. I think these things are very beautiful in general. So it becomes from a beauty place, but there's also a depth to it. And I think I very much collect the things that I find on my travels because it's all storytelling. It's your own story, right?
Right. Now I have two last questions. One is, why did you decide to establish yourself in Milan?
Well, look, Italy is our number one country. It was also the first place that I ever traveled to, and the university was a formative experience for me. And so maybe I'm channeling that thing of when I was most curious in my life. So there's a practical thing. The other thing as well is that I think Milan is in an interesting moment, a dynamic moment. I love Italians. And then also Linate makes my life very easy.
The airport.
Yes, it really does.
Why traveling is so important?
On one hand, I think it's one of the things that can kind of save us, because if you understand the humanity of other people and their situations and understand that it's only by luck that we're born into certain places, right? So if you understand that, there is a different kind of decision-making people would make, whether it's on conflict or climate change and all of those things. The other thing as well is that I think it becomes the story that people tell themselves about the world about themselves, if that makes sense. And which is why that's the exciting thing about doing what we do, is that I can put people in the story and help them craft that story that they want to tell themselves about the world and themselves, if that makes sense. So it's about building your own identity and understanding that it's an enriching thing for yourself and everyone.
I think that what is important is nowadays, you can through Google or see everything on your telephone, from museums, collection, places, animals, landscapes, flowers, trees, seas, and so on and so forth. Do you think that traveling is a good way to double check? In the telephone, you don't have the voices, you don't have smells. And so are people traveling less because they can Google everything, or instead are they traveling more because by Googling they get the desire to go and see or to touch with their very hands?
I think we're in an interesting moment where it could go either way with AI. You can get a perfectly strong itinerary now, and it will only become more refined by saying, I'm interested in this place, create me 2 days. I would like to say that it was super erroneous, but it's getting better and better all the time. So that will give you a good itinerary. But the access and the connection to people and the feeling of things is not going to come through this device. So I think it will only become more valuable. People will want these in real life experiences. We don't know exactly where that will land. My gut instinct says the desire for connection will be so strong that will be the thing that people ultimately want, because they think the irony, of course, is that we think we're connected, but we're actually disconnected.
Thank you very much for your time.
Pleasure.
Alain Elkann interviews.